Okay, I think it is probably go time now. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone that's come along. So just to get us started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm beaming in for, the Awabakal people, and I'd like to extend my acknowledgement to. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people who are joining us today. And if you'd like to say which country you're on today in the chat, please do. That would be fantastic. My name's Julia Cook. I'm a member of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre. So welcome to our second event in our seminar series for this year. This event is on new possibilities, young people, and democratic renewal, and it's based on a really exciting project that this team have been working on around young people and climate activism and the kind of democratic possibilities that it throws up. When we were planning the seminar series, we knew this was a kind of project and team that we really wanted to include. So really excited for this session. So in terms of how we'll proceed, we're going to have each of our speakers present, and we'll be taking our questions in the chat, and we'll address them towards the end of the session. The aim is for it to work in quite a kind of cohesive way, since it's all coming from the same project. So yes, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll get to them. And so to begin with, I'm going to hand over to Pip Collin.
Thanks, Julia, and hi, everybody. It's really, really great to be here, and thank you so much to the crew at Newcastle for inviting us all to be a part of this seminar series. So yeah, as Julia just said, this project is called New Possibilities, Young People and Democratic Renewal. And I want to start just by acknowledging that today's presentation draws on, well, the broad project, but not all of our team members are here. It's an ARC-funded project with an all-star cast, including high school students, undergraduate and master's students, young climate activists and leaders, including Varsha, who's joining us today on the panel. And so, yeah, it's just a really wonderful thing to be able to all speak to different aspects of this project with you all, even though we can't actually fit all of the project into one panel presentation. But I guess where I want to start is just to give you a bit of an overview of the project. So with each passing season, heat and extreme weather events are being broken right around the world. Whole systems are collapsing and intersecting large-scale changes such as artificial intelligence are really amplifying the consequences of global warming. Amongst this, there is a persistent concern that our democracies are really not up to the task. And while every democracy requires generational renewal, one of the long-standing limitations of existing democracies from our point of view is that they formally exclude children and young people in ways that really undermine their rights first and foremost, but also the kind of creative thinking and intergenerational perspectives on the problems that we face, especially climate change. And at the same time, in 2018, we saw young people around the world escalate their advocacy and activism. And so in 2019, we set out to understand what was happening and the implications of this for democracy. This is a now iconic image of 80,000 students and their supporters rallying in the Domain in Sydney on the 20th of September in 2019. And they were joined by about 350,000 young people around Australia and an estimated 2.6 million internationally. And actually, this was the first strike our team and volunteers, all 14 of us, collected in protest surveys, captured images of placards, and made broader observations of who was there and what they were doing. In the 2018 and especially the many of the protests that have followed, we've been collecting data. So along with digital ethnography, so kind of looking at the movement, trying to understand who are the climate actors in this space and what they're doing online. And Luigi's going to speak a bit more to that today. We have been doing live action observation and surveys and in protest surveys in particular, and photo capture at every protest event in Sydney since 2019, and then also others around Australia, including Brisbane, Byron Bay, Castlemaine and Melbourne. We've done in-depth interviews with people taking part, with adult allies, with organisers, and also with decision makers at different levels of government. And then we've also been looking at the ways in which particularly children and young people are framed, the way in which they are constructing themselves through different forms of media and social media, but also the ways in which they are, I guess, configured through the visual language of the movement. And underpinning all of this for our project is really a participatory approach where we've been working with students, both in the creation of the methods, the collection of the data, the interpretation of the data, including in participatory workshops. We've also been creating case studies with students of particular aspects of the research that we've been doing and turning those into communications around the research, its findings and its implications, and then also creating what we're calling public pedagogy events. And these are really about bringing together a diverse public, if you like, to prompt learning and action. So just kind of going back to the context of the research itself, in the 2018 and especially the September 2019 strikes and the many that followed, young people who produced what Rancia would call a significant interruption to the natural order of domination by those who are usually excluded from the political sphere. So in protests and other forms of climate advocacy and action, including speech making, strategic litigation, legislation, and direct action, young people are claiming what Rancia would call the right to have rights. But this claim doesn't go unanswered. While many have celebrated students' strikes and other forms of action, the challenge of recognising and activating youth climate advocacy and activism for renewing democracy, I think, is really epitomised by this now infamous quote in 2018 by the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. And even though the federal government in Australia has changed, the focus of much of the media and political commentary has been on appropriate youth engagement in democracy and contemporary processes of political socialisation, and why they should be in school, and have really largely ignored the substantive concerns and calls for policy to arrest climate change. So in our project, as a way of kind of thinking ourselves out of what we would call the politics of youth, we've been thinking about we've been looking at how we can rethink politics itself through what young people are doing and saying in the movement. And to summarise this very briefly, part of the reason we would argue why the former and even our current Prime Minister think young people still belong in schools and not on the streets or in the halls of Parliament is that the deficit view of students as becoming and normative understandings of politics remains dominant. These have continue to fuel really concerns of a crisis of democracy, and we see this most recently in the kind of debates around the civics learning assessments of Year 6 and Year 10 students. And this is kind of like reinforced this lens that the problem that we're facing is that young people are failing to develop the necessary norms and values to sustain Western democracies. But this is despite a really significant body of political participation research that shows young people and many older people are breaking with institutional routines, attitudes, and approaches. They include like new repertoires, new actors, new targets of political action, moving away, but not completely rejecting government. And so, you know, really, this is the kind of crux that we're interested in. We're interested in how how young people's activism and advocacy reflects what Rancière would call a break in the natural order of domination, particularly by the part of those who have no part. So our focus is really on disruption, claim making, and how we can interpret what young people are doing differently. So we've documented a great many ways. Some are mundane, some are sensational, of how young people are claiming this part, and to draw on Biesta with this idea of kind of public pedagogy, how young people are becoming public. Reading through Biesta, we've been thinking about the way in which becoming public is a claim to the right to have rights, that it's not about a physical relocation from the home to the street, but about the achievement of a form of togetherness in which, to put it in the language of Hannah Arendt, action is possible and freedom can appear. And so achieving this kind of togetherness is not something that can be staged by someone with already existing authority, but rather by someone who interrupts. And such interruptions can take the form of what Rancière calls dissensus. So dissensus is not, from our point of view, to be understood as the opposition of interests or opinions, but rather the production, and I'm quoting, within a determined sensible world of a given that is heterogeneous to it. So this is the kind of work that we're trying to do in this project, to see where these things are happening and to interpret the implications of that for democracy. So before I hand over to my colleagues, I just want to run through a couple of very high-level examples. So in terms of the claiming rights, young people's actions, speeches, signs, and placards are deliberately made to be read by a public audience, including peers, politicians, and policymakers. And they tell us, more importantly, what students mean when they strike. So we can read the protests themselves as a claim to the right to have rights, but the placards tell us about the meaning and the nature of the rights claims that people are making. So, for example, and this is just an extremely small sample of about 2,000 images that we've collected and analysed. Young people First Nations rights are a key part of the ways in which young people are articulating their concerns for climate justice, particularly through the protests. Of course, First Nations young people in this country have been resisting the destructive forces of colonisation and acting to care for country, at least since the arrival of the British. But in the current movement, First Nations young people have been front and centre, reminding us that there can be no climate justice without First Nations justice, and indeed that the movement itself needs decolonising. The second area is around age. So by taking to the streets with the support of many elders, young people are aware they're not full citizens. They note the various ways in which they're positioned as outsiders, and that they have provisional status to full political and civic rights. And the other theme is one around that this is a movement led by women and girls, and there's a strong articulation of the way climate justice is a question of gender justice. The second area is around this idea of togetherness. So climate activists are not acting alone. They are always in relation with others, including a great many allies. So we see this when parents, workers, unions, movements, knitting nanas, others are taking part in the protests, when climate cafes are staged between artists, scientists, psychologists, activists, when people are dancing and celebrating art. Varsha might mention it later, but we've been putting together a podcast which is trying to keep some of these conversations going. And of course, in the work that they've been doing around strategic litigation and legislation, young people are inserting themselves into many spaces from which they're normally excluded. And I just want to end by a quick comment on dissensus. I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, but Biesta reminds us that dissensus is about introducing an incommensurable element or an event or an experience or an object that can act as a test and a reminder of publicness. And I think Judith will speak much more to this, but one of the examples, that I think is most recent is of young people utilising the mechanisms of adultist institutions like the UN to insert themselves into those spaces via, for example, filing a complaint to the Special Rapporteur on climate change. And what they're doing here is actually utilising these mechanisms to open up, maintain, and to reconfigure these as avenues which can democratise democracy. And with that, I think I'll pass over to Judith.
Okay, so thanks so much, Pip. Judith, are you happy to go next?
Or Rob, sorry.
I think the plan was for Luigi to go
Yeah,
next.
I thought it was Luigi.
Yep, Luigi, are you happy to jump in?
Yep.
I beg your pardon. Thanks, Luigi.
Right.
No worries. Yeah, I might need to share my slides. Yeah.
Pip, if you just stop
I think-
sharing for now.
I think yeah. Right.
That's working.
All right. So, okay, so can you see my slides? Yeah. Yeah. All right. So today we're gonna speak a little bit about a work we're doing on still like in a draft forms on listening with Pip, and we're gonna focus really on government response to student climate action, and we're gonna frame this response with the concept of listening. Okay. So there's been mostly, in the literature, I think a lot of focus on voice, especially in policy and advocacy circles, in terms of there's a lot about like giving young people a voice, and what we notice that and this is the critique that comes from the literature is often when we talk about young people voice, we talk about adult-centric way to consult young people, and these kind of models can be seen, in dominant forms of participation, where young people are considered as claim makers rather than fully participating actors, and the focus really very often on their like voice or where they speak and how they speak, rather than think about their participation, more like in general. So what we kind of do, in this, paper, we kind of, go back and look at the, literature around listening, and there's different kind of literature across different kind of disciplines. There's a lot of, around listening and communication, especially in organizational communication. So there's, for example, the work of Jim McNamara, and what is called the architecture of listening. So what institution organization needs to do, in order to get closer, to other, customers or citizens, and he kind of theorized and said that in order to listen to publics, they really need to embed listening into their organizational practices. There's like there are more critical approach to listening and to participation. For example, there's Dre, who talks about listening and dissent and the importance of dissent in democracy. and also conflict as a generative process that allow, create opportunity for deliberation. And then there's a work, on epistemic justice and protest, and this is in particular, focusing on marginalized group, and making sure that marginalized group can actually fully participate, because their knowledge is important, and they kind of provide, and contribute with the knowledge to decision making. But what we kind of, we propose in this, in this work we've done, is to look at listening as a governance, where, listening is really, kind of a way to, for government to interpret like public claims from young people, and also, to incorporate these claims, into policy making. So the reason why we talk about listening is because there are different forms of participation, and Pip kind of mentioned some of them. In my work in this project, I've been focusing mostly on online advocacy, and there's really a lot of literature. We've done some work on online advocacy and protest event dissemination, through social media as part of this project. But as you can see now from this table, they have done for one of the publication for this project. There's there is a lot of literature that talks about the different ways that young people use online and digital media to participate in political discussion. So they use social media to discuss and debate within themselves, but also not to organize the action, and also to organize across different movement organization. They use social media to participate and engage, but also to take action. There's a lot of studies that also look at how young people are represented online by mainstream news media, and also how young people counter-represent these representations. And there's also studies around how platform design and algorithms also play a role in online advocacy. And this is kind of, it's relevant to listening also because there's a work of digital media scholars that have been working on listening as as a way to shift, as an opportunity to shift away the focus on from voice into participation and listening, try to understand what other people are saying, and Crawford in particular talk about the focus on voice, especially in the early digital forms of early digital culture, and also talks about lurking and as actual legitimate forms of listening online, of participation. So listening as a form of participation itself. As well as this work of from organizational listening that talks about the importance of active empathetic listening from organization to publics, and the importance of listening for trust, and the fact that when listening is not genuine or is not honest, then there is like a lack of legitimacy for the organization. But especially in the Lyme context, there's also words of caution, just like in terms of the importance of being also pointing out that there's this visibility trap. So young people, and activists in general, need to use social media for advocacy, but at the same time, there's a risk of monitoring, and surveillance by governments or even organizations that use like the amplification of of their message as a form to track activists. So there is also a word of caution there in terms of digital listening that can also enable forms of surveillance. So in what we look at, as part of this paper is so how government respond to forms of youth participation, and we've been looking at 5 examples that are forms of response from the government to youth-driven initiatives, and our response there, have been public visible. So the response, they've been, in the news, and we track them, and we use these examples to kind of come up with a spectrum of government response or government listening to young people. And the example we looked at, is like, the example that already Pip mentioned of POCOC, and then, duty of care bill that was, presented by POCOC. It was created with a group of, young people. And this is, we consider this, as a form of, active listening. So as a form of a way to include young people into policy making. And then another example of government response is, top-down forms of participation. And we looked at group, advisory group, like, for example, the youth advisory groups that have been created, especially in the last few years, as a response to the youth participation, especially around climate change. There's been really there's been we witnessed the creation of a lot of advisory groups, but very often, and this critique comes from different parts. These advisory groups are kind of very top-down forms of organization, but also they do recommendations. So there is the advisory role. It means that the decision that this group makes not always impacts decision making. And then we have the other
2 minutes,
form.
Luigi.
Yeah, thank you. Then we have even like forms of restriction, or closure of spaces of listening. And the social media ban is, like, you're all probably familiar with that, as one of these examples that we looked at. And then, of course, there's also silencing. So example of criminalization of process. I'm sure, like, Rob probably Judith is going to talk about this as well. And finally, there's also a risk of, these forms of, surveillance and surreptitious listening. And this is one example here, one example of how digital media sometimes also used, and digital technology also used to surveil and monitor activists. So what this example, kind of like, summarizing this example, tells us is not that there is a spectrum of governmental listening, and that can go from formal participatory listening to forms of surveillance. And this kind of tells that listening can be used, and engagement can take very different forms. So just to conclude, because I think I'm running out of time. So we're talking about listening, in this context, it kind of allows us to consider young people as, active and full political actors. Also, listening as a concept, allows us to think about epistemic justice, and consider young people as epistemic agents. And then listening also allows us to take into consideration also forms of vernacular politics and different forms of online expression. And listening can also be, in this sense, transformative, in the sense that listening can also shape. It's not just like a concept, but can also shape the way government interpret engagement with the young people. So just to kind of one takeaway point, talking about listening allows us to make visible the way in which governments engage and and listen, respond to activism and different form of participation. So it is like an analytical lens, but also it's a normative agenda in the sense, that it allows us, to shift away attention from like youth voices and what they do to what we do and what the government do to fully engage with young people. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Luigi. And next up we have Rob Watts. And just a quick reminder as well, please do pop any questions or comments in the chat for our presenters.
Okay, we're on.
I hope you can hear me. Just nod. Yep, great, lovely. Thank you. I'm with Judith, and we're on Wurundjeri land here in Naarm or Melbourne. The context clearly is the context of what we can call a polycrisis or the Anthropocene, which, as Brunello to put it, fully reveals the fragility of the place we terrestrials call home. Maybe here. Just working out how to advance the slides.
Go.
So there are two, in this context, people have responded to the crisis of the Anthropocene. There are two striking facts about Australia's response to the climate warming crisis. There's good evidence suggesting that there's been huge numbers of rallies and climate strikes, marches, blockade events in the last decade or so. These numbers by people like Gulliver and others clearly underestimate the actual extent of this protest and dissent, but it's pretty significant. And it was very significant that we saw a big increase in 2018, 2019. And we can say that we need to advance.
That's not working.
Hi there, try that one.
That's not good.
No, I don't know.
Bugger. Okay.
No. We're just struggling to work out how to make the slides advance.
They're not moving.
They're not moving.
Okay, my suggestion is unshare and reshare. It might be frozen.
Try this one.
So stop screen sharing and then try starting the process, screen sharing process again.
Oh shit, stop sharing.
Yep. We'll try that again. Sorry,
Okay.
folks.
No worries, it happens.
Make sure you get the right one.
Yes, we'll get the right one. That one there.
It's yours. That's yours.
Fine. Share. Try that again. That's it.
There we go. Success.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for that, Julia. Wonderful. And almost undoubtedly, one of the key factors in the general increase in climate activism in the period after 2018 was we saw huge numbers of children joining movements like School Strike for Climate, taking to the street. So they were exercising what we can properly call voice. They were not exiting, they were voicing. And into that context, we slipped our research project. Second time lucky, the Morrison government tried to veto the project in the first instance successfully, and then we got it off the ground the next year. The other striking fact, which is the one I want to focus on today, is that Australia has the unenviable, or in some people's eyes, perhaps enviable record for the highest arrest rates of climate and environmental protesters in the world. Good research released earlier this year by Berglund and others in England indicated that more than 1 in 5 of all climate and environmental protests in Australia far exceed the average, the global average. So we've set ourselves a bit of a striking record for repressing and criminalising peaceful environmental dissent. And that seems to be the context in which I want to think particularly about the status of children in this context. By children, I mean to refer essentially to anyone under the age of 18 who have been clearly key figures in the project of calling governments to account on climate change. So the clear point, adopting a relational perspective, is that if widespread peaceful protest is one political response to the crisis, so too is widespread state-sponsored repression, especially by liberal democratic governments. And that poses, I think, one very large question about the status of liberal democracies in the 2020s, who lay claim to uphold rule of law principles, democratic accountability and participatory ethos as normative defences of whatever they mean by a liberal democratic regime. And it does seem to me that the evidence of widespread state-sponsored repression of dissent in so many liberal democracies points to a huge gap between theory and practice, or promise and accomplishment. It's in that context that I set out a year or so back to ask two simple questions. Why and how, or how and why, do liberal democratic governments criminalise peaceful climate and environment protesters, and especially children and young people? And I want to point to a very obvious and symptomatic problem when it comes to the criminalisation of young children who are engaging in climate protest. So the second question is, what does the criminalisation of children's climate protest reveal about the status of children, their right to have rights, as Pippa channeling Rancière would put it, and of human rights in liberal democracies more generally? It's a fairly important thing to note that even self-proclaimed left and progressive Labor governments do this with great aplomb, this criminalisation of dissent. So there are four ways I suggest that, in general, liberal democracies criminalise climate and environment protests in general. The first is to introduce new legislation, to amend old legislation, to create new offences, to target certain groups of offenders, and to increase the penalties for existing offences. We can say, again, building on the work of others, that in the last 20 years, governments around Australia have enacted at least 49 new pieces of legislation targeting environment and climate protesters. And New South Wales, where most of you are, again, has the record for doing this more than other state governments. A common element of all this legislative overkill is that there's a reliance on vague and ill-defined offences and/or sanctioning excessive police powers and responses. The second way that governments in Australia have criminalised peaceful protest is to use police to prevent protests from taking place, to infiltrate movements, enable the police to stop and search people, make arrests, or even use physical violence if push comes to shove, as it were. The third way that governments are criminalising protest is to use the courts, particularly the magistrates' courts, to prosecute and criminalise activities and curb environment and climate protest. Human Rights Watch here in Australia has reported that climate protesters are being increasingly and disproportionately subjected to vindictive legal action by Australia's courts. Again, magistrates in New South Wales have been imposing very harsh conditions, refusing bail on climate protests, and doing so in ways that violate basic rights. And there's been a lot of effort, pushback, to try and use the appellate process in courts to reclaim rights that magistrates' courts were denying. And finally, and of course, as you'd guess, there's also rhetorical criminalisation as governments engage in the stigmatisation, name-calling, protesters who are talked about in highly denigratory ways as terrorists and thugs and idiots and extremists, radicals and vandals. And that goes to Magistrate Alison Hawkins, who should have known better when she described Coco Dean as childish and emotional before she gave her a 15-month sentence. And even in Victoria, our own progressive Labor Premier calls out the stupid behaviour of Extinction Rebellion peaceful protesters. So that's the way we deal with climate protests in general. One question clearly is that this points to is, this is clearly at odds with all of the things we like to claim about Australia as a liberal democracy. And as recently as late last year, the Attorney General's Department was still putting onto its webpage the claim that the right to peaceful assembly protects the right of individuals, and this is this is a fundamental part of Australia's claim to be a liberal democracy. Okay, the question is, how do Liberal governments in particular criminalise children. And this is where I think it gets to a very interesting point. It is clear that by and large children, that is people up to the age of 18, are treated in quite different ways to the rest of the protest movement, and older people, that is young people and really old people like me. Children have not been targeted by new laws. They are intimidated by police and sometimes arrested, but if arrested, children never face courts or are sentenced. I think that exceptional treatment points to the most interesting part of today's talk on my part anyway. What does this say about the status, the political status of children?
2 minutes, Rob.
The criminalising of peaceful protests, I think, by children reveals the very odd political status of children. I've been able to estimate that, and again, this is a gross understatement, but there's a reason for this problem, that between 2019 and late 24, I've been able to establish that at least 27 children under 18 and a few just over 18 have been arrested at climate protests in Australia. Again, most of those protests have taken place in New South Wales. But the point is this: children like 13-year-old Izzy Raj Seps have not been targeted by new laws. Police will try to intimidate them, and there's a marvellous account by David Shoebridge, a Green MP, of what a 40-man squad of riot police fully kitted up in Kirribilli outside Prime Minister Scott Morrison's Kirribilli residence in December 29 looked like. It was a grotesque exercise in seriously intimidatory, potentially highly violent police presence directed at school children. And again, you have to ask yourself, and in what sort of social world, political world, is this possible? If children are arrested at climate protests, and as I say, some have been, it is usually only for disobeying a move on order. They're not being arrested for any other statutory offences. Once arrested as children, they cannot be named because of the general application of a diversionary principle at stake in place in most magistrates' courts. That alone makes research just about impossible. You can't even get the name of someone who's under 18 who's been arrested. They don't face courts and they're unlikely to be sentenced. Most will be given either diversionary orders or they will simply be thrown out of the police station, told to go home and get back to their homework. So there is a very odd status that we're seeing here about children. It points, in my view, to the continuing effect of a pervasive paternalism, that children need to be protected from adults, from adult activity, from, in this case, political activity and dissenting activity, and that whatever the rights of the child are under a UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, there is a very odd effect at stake here. They need to be protected because of their vulnerability to exploitation and abuse and being used by manipulative adults. So while there are rights to have rights for children, these are severely compromised, and in my judgment, the UNCCRC reminds us that children have yet to be treated as the full quid, as having the kinds of rights which we associate normatively with being an adult. And I think that points to a very significant set of issues about the continuing effect of paternalism and other adultist premises. We'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. And next we have Judith Besant.
Okay, just
Close that down.
I'm trying to. You want to get out? Okay.
I think the best way for this one is probably stop sharing and then reshare with your presentation.
Okay.
Sure.
Yes, it's mine. Okay, share.
Uploading.
Sorry.
No worries. So we can still see Rob. So I think
Yes, we got rid of too.
need to kind of stop sharing that one first.
Okay, sorry.
Let's go back.
No problem.
Oh,
Get rid of it.
stop sharing. That's better. Now we can go again. And where's yours? Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah, perfect. We can see that.
You want to put
Phew,
it there?
okay.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, let's go, Geronimo. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about strategic litigation and law reform and young people. So the context we all know about, which is the climate crisis or the planetary crisis. And to avert that, we need to have net zero greenhouse emissions, but the effects we're experiencing now are nothing like that which we'll experience as the temperatures ramp up. So the thing is that time does matter. We're running out of time and we need to take action. The only problem is that governments are asleep, not just governments. They're not always asleep. They're obvious. Sometimes they're actually quite awake and know what they're doing, but they're not doing what is required. So in this context, many children, young people have taken action, and it's happened in a few ways. I'm going to focus on strategic litigation between judicial and quasi-judicial bodies, and also presenting new bills to Parliament. We saw recently, last week or so, a recent ruling by the International Court of Justice that was initiated by some students in Vanuatu that created a whole lot of new possibilities for action against states that are not doing enough to avert climate change. I'll talk about more of that in a minute. We've also seen, going back a bit, this was significant, Sachin versus Argentina, when a bunch of young people, about 16, took for their 5 states to the UN to address climate change. And the case, unfortunately, was dismissed because it was determined that they did not exhaust all the local remedies first. So even though the UN didn't recognise the harms caused by climate change, it did set the scene for recognising cross-border government responsibilities for climate change. And that is really significant, especially for places like Australia, where a lot of the harms that are being caused are generated by the fact that we outsource or export something around 80% of the gas and fuel. Plus we're a very high gas emitter, so it's got implications for the future. So let's just focus on Australia for a minute. And a lot of young people have been taking action, solidarity with their elders, and this is a famous case that got kick-started in 2020. Some have been successful and some have not. Now, the Sharma case was initiated by Sharma with others and 7 other students. She filed action in the federal court claiming that the minister owed them a duty of care to her and other students. The minister at the time, Susan Ley, replied by saying that first of all, the severity of the climate change were speculative, not real, and she did not owe a duty of care as alleged. However, the presiding judge, Bromberg, disagreed, and he said it was reasonably foreseeable that the minister did that the risks of harm to the Australian children would flow from emissions from the extension of the mine in question, and that the minister had a duty of care because they had direct control over those risks. And that was his ruling. Soon after, she didn't like that. She said the government obviously didn't owe a duty of care, and a full federal court overturned Bromberg's judgment on appeal. However, the court did not disagree that there was a duty of care. What they said was that it's not the job of the courts to make that decision. It's the job of Parliament to impose such a duty of care. So it's not that he disagreed with there being, or not, the federal court didn't disagree that there wasn't a duty of care. However, this is significant too. While the court upheld the government's appeal and rejected the minister's claim, he did find that there was in fact significant risk of harm due to climate change. That was upheld. Hang on. And soon after that, Sharma, in conjunction with independent Senator Pocock, introduced a bill, and the aim of that bill was to do, as the federal court suggested, try and change the law, to create a duty on the part of the government to consider the health and well-being of young people. But again, the Australian Labor Party and the coalition opposed it and refused to accept such a duty of care because they didn't want to be held legally liable. That's a pretty scary thing. So the matter did not proceed. So there are a number of ways that we see laws being used or trying to enact change through human rights arguments, through duties like duty of care, and also through torts law. And there have been trends have been increasing in this sort of action. We've seen sort of a 50% increase in judgments favourable with favourable outcomes. And what this has meant is that the governments and others, like many in the corporate sector, are really worried about this being used for past and current and future damages. I think they're girding their loins. There is fear, there is worry about the significance and the ability of this kind of action to have an effect. So we've seen responses from the corporate sector and also government in terms of misinformation and misleading claims about their products. We've seen various kinds of greenwashing and also litigation against greenwashing. This person here, Kata O'Donnell, she took action against the government some time ago as a student from La Trobe University for not disclosing the risks about climate change in respect to the sovereign bond investors. So people were making investments, but they were not disclosing. So she was quite successful, but I don't know how effective she was. Another kind of response that's coming forth is calls to get rid of the pesky lawfare, what they call pesky lawfare, moves to deter lawfare or legal processes that delay, prevent fossil fuel projects and that give citizens legal accountability. So we've seen moves to silence, like Luigi and Rob talked about, that have had a chilling effect. And we've seen shifts in places like Northern Territory where they've actually legislated so the courts cannot take action of the kind that we've been talking about before. I think that was last year. So I'm just, in conclusion, making a couple of observations, then I'm going to ask a question. So in Australia, recently, in the last few years, we've seen moves to reform Australian laws to enact a duty of care. We've seen 4 at least, and 3 of those 4 were initiated by children. And they're the ones that I just talked about, the Sharma one, and then Pocock, and the appeal as well. Now, in each of those 3 cases, the government rejected it had a duty of care. Yet, in 2024, the government had a moment of awakening and it recognised that it did have a duty of care in respect to social media. Let's close down access to social media for young people under the age of 16, a debate from which young people were largely missing. And then the government intends to contract out its sovereignty or regulation to social media platforms by requiring them to take reasonable steps to prevent harm. That's another story. So, and DITO, even though there's been a lot of positive talk about the International Court of Justice and the ruling in respect to Vanuatu, the child and children's rights have been largely missing from that. There's been a lot of behind the scenes criticism about the particular ruling, and I haven't got time to go into that either. So despite, the observation is that despite the high visibility of young people in these cases that I've been talking about, and their voice, they're on mute or they're largely invisible. And my question is, how do we explain this? How do we explain when the children, young people are calling governments to account by requiring duty of care to be legislated, and yet and there's a refusal to do it? So how might we explain that? I've got some ideas about what the answers might be, but that's just a question, and on that I shall say thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Judith. And so next we have a conclusion from Pip.
We need to mute.
Thanks, everyone. So, I mean, we're in the final year of this project, and there is a lot more to analyse and work with the team to bring it all together. And so I'm actually really just wanting to hand over straight away to Varsha to prompt us into our thinking straight away. But and also hear from all of you, because this is a fantastic time for our team to really be chewing over some of the questions that arise from this work, and hearing people's advice and thoughts on the implications of it all. But I guess just by way of very brief conclusion, I mean, if we return to our initial question that is driving this project, how can we renew democracy and address the climate crisis with young people? We are acutely aware that we are in relation with all of the people that we are researching with, and many of the people on this call. So it's quite wonderful to see so many of the other researchers who are doing work in this space. But what we are fundamentally thinking about is the need for this to be a transdisciplinary effort. So you probably got a sense from the range of presentations just today on several slivers of the work that have arisen from this project, that we're trying to think with a transdisciplinary approach around this question, whether that's from a sociological, criminological, social policy, media and communications or design perspective. We're acutely aware that we need new approaches, and fundamental to this is a return to the idea that politics and democracy are not given. They're enacted, and democracy is at best an ideal. What we can see in our research is the relational nature of youthful politics in making politics and democracy. And in our final work in the project, what we're trying to do is to really refine the theories, concepts, settings, and relations that we think are necessary to learn from this work in an effort to renew democracy with young people. So for us, this is really very much about returning to that concept of human togetherness, and Arendt's idea of action being possible and creating the space in which freedom can appear. Precisely because I think at a time when creativity, collaboration and dialogue matter more than ever to our capacity as a society to respond to global warming, rethinking with young people emerges as the most essential and viable and necessary option to addressing both the dual crises of climate change and contemporary democracy. With that, I'll pass to Varsha to give us a reality check.
Thank you, Pip. Hi, everyone. My name's Varsha, and I'm an associate researcher at the Young Australian Research Centre, and I've just finished up at uni doing a law and politics degree, and have also been working at Equity Generation Lawyers for the past 5 years as a paralegal and now as a law grad. And I guess my journey in the climate movement started in 2018 when I joined the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and did their student climate leadership program. And shortly after that, School Strike for Climate was kind of founded in Australia, in Sydney, and I joined that team. So I guess for me, from where we were in 2019 having massive strikes to where we've come now, to the point where School Strike for Climate doesn't necessarily have any active members or isn't very, in existence anymore, I guess. It's a really interesting pipeline and trajectory. And I think there are some incredible points made, and I see this research being so valuable just because people seem to either want to use young people as like test subjects or and then just kind of discount their views. They don't seem to want to actually bring young people along for the journey. But I think the incredible thing about this project and like all the projects kind of around this that have brought young people along the ride to actually understand what the research process is and why it's valuable has also helped translate all the academic language and all the academic kind of lingo into a more accessible and engaging way where young people are also aware that this research exists. I feel like throughout working with Pip and Michelle as well on the Silent Majority podcast, one thing I realized is that, wow, there's all these pieces of research and I had no idea that they existed, but they'd be so valuable if they were heard and seen more by, like if one of my friends saw it, for instance, or if somebody outside of the climate movement was able to actually understand and hear from the researchers themselves and also hear from the young people that are part of this process. So this research has so much value. And I was a paralegal for Kata's case actually about the government bonds, and it's been interesting seeing how now climate litigation has kind of taken on a new life in terms of being another avenue, because I guess prior to joining a law firm, my entire sort of experience in advocacy was just protest. And it was completely informal lobbying. But since then, being able to understand the role of the law and what value it actually has in creating change and having those informal and formal lobbying spaces combined has been great. I think for me, the biggest example of that was the case against the environment minister brought by Sharma and others. So that was 8 school strikers who sued the environment minister saying that you have a duty of care to us. That day of the trial in Melbourne outside the federal court, we had a protest, and that's probably the first time that I've seen a protest like that really happen right in front of my eyes. With Anjali Sharma was organizing it and had brought all of her like fellow school strikers along to, she had marshals, she had everything. And then an hour later we were inside court and we were hearing our barristers give submissions. So I think it really is that power of actually combining the different avenues, and research clearly has so much value, and I think it's being underestimated. And at a time when the climate movement feels like it doesn't have as much support, the attention economy, I guess for a lot of people the focus is on cost of living, housing, Palestine, whatever that be, and rightly so that attention is given there, but also making sure that the role of climate as an intersectional issue is highlighted is so important. And with every every idea that was presented today, it's clear that what we see with climate activism is surveillance, like increased surveillance. It's the safety of children, it's the safety of older generations as well. And all of that is at stake. I can say that before COVID and after COVID, the police presence at protests has just risen by so much. There was protests that we would do completely COVID safe in line with guidelines. There would be at least a half or sometimes even double the number of police officers there compared to people striking. There would be 10 of us and 20 of them. And it would really make you question, like, why? And I think since then we've kind of stuck with the same sentiment of, oh, we need it for safety, but that's really not what it's about. It's about control and authority and kind of bullying people away from protests. So I feel like research has such an ability to actually change that, and bringing young people along for the ride as well, and to really inform them and work with them instead of just work on them and say, you're my test subject today. I've had such a good experience, and yeah, I'm finding these spaces so valuable. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Vasha. So that's all of our speakers. I think we can now turn over to some questions, and I can see we've been getting more and more in the chat. If you have anything in mind, please feel free to pop it in. And so I think it might make most sense if we start with with some of these more recent questions because they're responding to Varsha's talk just now. So from Vanessa, we have a question about Vanessa saying, I wondered about the ability of young people to manage all of these pressures, which I think would be, you know, cost of living, like other kind of protest movements like Palestine, alongside environmental advocacy. Varsha, do you have anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I think it is tricky, and yeah, it definitely shouldn't be up to, you know, young people to fix these problems. But I think what's become really clear is that the more young people understand the intersectionality of these issues, the more they can engage with different issues and also feel like they're not as overwhelmed. I found that recognizing how interconnected everything is means that, you know, when I'm talking about climate, I'm indirectly also talking about cost of living. And I think for young people, a lot of us at least tend to channel our anger or anxiety about these issues into going into advocacy or working in these spaces. And I feel like being able to understand that element is really, really helpful. But I also think that there is that extra layer of, for instance, having, you know, being a person of color and what that's like, and having different barriers in the way as well. I find that the environment movement has been a little bit tricky to find other folks of color in, for instance, just because of whether that's financial barriers or there's class barriers or there is racism in these spaces that isn't talked about enough. So I think it's a tricky situation, but understanding that all of these issues at the end of the day are connected, and really talking about them like that helps a lot.
Fantastic, thank you.
One of the things, Julia, do you mind if I just jump in there as well?
Of course, please do.
Just because one of the things that we've been looking at is, so in attending all of the School Strike for Climate and climate strikes more generally in Sydney over the last now nearly 6 years, one of the things we've been able to do is map the ways in which people in those protests are connecting questions of climate justice with other issues or events. So, for instance, ahead of the 2022 election, you know, there was a huge amount of dialogue and a lot of posters which kind of were speaking directly to the political issues of the candidates in the lead up to the election. In 2023, when there are a lot of protests around violence against women and families, many of the protests had a lot of a focus on women and girls and violence prevention and so on. In the lead up to the Voice referendum, we also saw those protests really speaking to the ways in which questions of First Nations justice, recognition and rights intersect with climate. So I think one of the things that we're really learning about is how young people are kind of bringing these different intersecting issues, as Varsha said, together in the public domain, and we do a whole lot of work apart from what we've presented today about the ways in which we can learn from the ways in which children and young people are communicating climate change, and that's about these kinds of the intersectional ways of understanding the issue. But the other thing is that we've also done interviews. We did interviews in 2024 with people who had been taking part in the protests, and it's true actually that a lot of people feel really worn down and burdened and overwhelmed by the range of issues. So there's a broader, I think, question that we all have to grapple with, which is around how do we balance out the way in which the grim realities of our current times are in our faces all the time, and particularly in the faces and minds of young people all the time, with a sense of hope and optimism. And again, that's, you know, one of the things that our project is interested in is the way in which moral and political emotions play a role in these questions. So that's something else maybe, you know, to talk about at a later date. But I think there's sort of, yeah, there is a broader question around how we as a society recognise and respond to that, because as Varsha said, it's not really up to young people to solve all of these problems, and it's not up to that. We should not be accepting a situation in which they also need to carry the emotional labour. So anyway.
Brilliant, thank you. And we have another question for Varsha from Milo. So, access to public research about climate protest and the criminalisation process is a perennial issue executed on a regular basis. Michael Barraway's ideas about public sociology and the need for sociologists to reach outside of the academy are still so salient about our kind of duty to the civil society. What, in your opinion, would be the most accessible format or avenue or platform to make the empirical research available? And is this even the best question about making more people inside the movement aware of the kind of empirical data that's available to inform them and to power their efforts? So there's a lot in that question. Thank you, Milo.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I think this is going to sound really silly, and I think it also does touch on the social media ban a little bit, but having research out in a really digestible way, like I do think young people are drawn to infographics and information that is kind of easy to digest. I think when you look at a lot of the news sources nowadays as well, they're kind of, it's not always the most helpful if they're putting just, you know, clickbait, but if they are just breaking it down and saying this happened or this is what we found, I find that that can be really impactful. And I think with the social media ban, that's kind of a worry that's quite a few people there. That's 14 to 16-year-olds who will not have access to that now. But I feel like some of the research is already being put out there. So you can definitely see where I think around the election, there was some polling done on whether young people were prioritizing climate as an issue, and even just putting that polling out there and saying, okay, no, we're still here, we're still listening. I think it was like at least 2/3 of young people were still, you know, putting climate front and center, and being able to actually just read that data on your phone. And I understand that it's probably not the most like articulate or even the most informative way of doing that, but I do think that using social media is really important, because one thing I have found is that going to events and things, people will say, oh, we should have young people on our board, or where do we find young people? They don't even want to join us. Like, we put a call out and it's on some random website that no young person would ever look at. So I think really just putting it front and center in front of them. Because if the goal is to have young people along and have them engage, it needs to, that needs to be thought about a little bit more. And that's why I think working with young people is so important, instead of just assuming that this is where they go, actually just hearing from them.
Fantastic, thank you. And Judith and Rob, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah. Hi, Milo. I just wanted to add that there's also, you know, the paywalls that everybody confronts unless they're sort of an academic, in terms of accessing the research through academic journals, which is an ongoing problem.
Yes, that's definitely true. And maybe that's kind of an interesting jumping off point as well to address the question we have from James about how the social media ban might influence or impact on your research.
Maybe I can kick off a response to that, and perhaps Luigi, you'll have something to say as well. I mean, one of the great luxuries of having an ARC Discovery project is it is set up to help researchers, at least in my view, respond to changing contexts. And so in this project, we very much lent on the concept of inventive methods of Lurie and Wakefield, in the sense that we haven't necessarily stuck with the methods that we started off with and thought that we would use. So for instance, we were planning to do large-scale surveying of the movement in 2023, and of course by 2023 protests had completely changed. So I think the same question goes for social media, that what we are looking at in the next 6 to 9 months is actually understanding the ways in which that change in the legislation might affect how young people access information, share their views, connect with others, and coordinate and plan online. But until such a time as we know exactly how the ban will be implemented, there's not much that we can do. And so ironically, I think what we're about to do our final round of interviews. And I think that the role of social media and the implications of the ban will definitely be something that we will look at. But I mean, obviously we've seen people like Anjali Sharma come out very strongly in public against the ban, pointing out that for many tens of thousands of young people, including herself, that her role and her ability to voice her opinions and to organise around for more action on climate change wouldn't have been possible without social media. So yeah, it's a tricky one. Luigi, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, kind of like, yeah, on what you're saying, I think it's been part of the project actually adjusting, especially with social media, adjusting the method to a changing environment. One of the things we had to adapt was for example, at the beginning, we were planning to map actors on Twitter, and there was before, Musk actually acquired the platforms, and then we had to kind of change a little bit the plan, focus more on platform like Instagram and TikTok, and I think I mean probably I think talking to people, so do like interviews, I think it probably would be like the most effective way to to do research also on social media nowadays. But that's, I think, the way we adapt has been mostly rather than looking at what young people do online is like we've been talking with young people and activists, and with them try to understand their thoughts, also their strategies, because I'm sure there's also going to be a lot of like way around to to access social media despite the ban. So I think it's going to be very interesting to explore there as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And so we have a question for Rob. This is another great one from Milo. If we continue going down the pathway of enfranchising 16-year-olds in liberal democracies, do you envision this will change the legal status of children becoming arrested? i.e., will youth enfranchisement embolden legislators and persecutors to persevere with prosecutions? Will they take that political risk, in your opinion? So will they be essentially kind of going after 16-year-olds if they're allowed to vote? Will they be more criminally responsible? Very good question.
Yes.
Tried.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Milo. And of course, one of the sticking points to date in the various attempts to lower the voting age has been the question, should we fine people who are 16 when they don't vote? And that has been the apparent public basis upon which Labor and opposition, the current opposition parties have said they don't support this idea. And it's caused a great deal of consternation for the Greens, who have been backing both in Canberra and at the national level the move to lower the voting age. So I think it just reinforces the point I was trying to make, that children at this point, that is people under 18, have a very odd status. The formal legal age of criminal responsibility varies, but it's somewhere between 10, 12, sometimes 14. But that's always covered up, if you like, by the principle that we really shouldn't throw the book at children, and that they should be put into a diversion program of some sort. So there's the premise immediately of a paternalism kicks in, so that children are somehow protected from either themselves or from whatever adults are doing with or to them. So I think it opens up that question, and given that I know what Judith thinks, but I'm very open to the idea that we should lower the voting age right down to whoever wants to vote whenever they express a wish to do so. And that could well mean that we had, a couple of million more people aged 10 or 11 or 12 putting their hands up to vote. And I do think that, without having thought it through, that it's not a bad thing then to hold everyone accountable in the way we do in this country, one of a small number of countries that make voting mandatory, that if you don't vote, there's a penalty, and that should be applied equally to everybody. But that may be a very controversial point of view. Judith's now kicking me, and
no, I'm just saying, I want to say something. Meanwhile, we lowered the age of criminal liability. And what was it in Queensland? Adult time, adult crime.
That's right.
So, you know, like, it's just another example of the incongruity, the arbitrary, you know, crazy thinking. So one minute, one area it's okay, the other area it's not. So there's no, it's not, you know, doesn't make sense.
So I think, to go back to Milo's point, the question of acknowledging that children have a political status and have political rights means they should be treated in accord with all the rest of us. That is, I'm not justifying the arrest of people for political protests. I think that's an outrage, unless there's some serious criminal offence being carried out, as well as whatever it is you're said to be doing when you're protesting. But I do think that there's, you know, that liberal principle of equality before the law should mean something. So I'm inclined to think that, yes, let's lower the voting age and let's hold people accountable. But let's also, more importantly, have a proper debate about whether we should be criminalising peaceful protest at all. And I think that is the debate we're not well able to have at this moment, given the dispositions of creatures like Chris Minns in New South Wales, or people like Jacinta Allen down here, who just routinely get stuck into protest because they think there's a vote in it. For them, when they take a tough law and order on crime position on peaceful protest.
If I can just add to that as well, Julia, and bring it back to Milo's question about you know, public scholarship and communicating research, is that I think this is also a question of like how we both surface like realities, but also make them available to empower people, particularly children and young people. So I think, like, to Judith's point, the incongruity between, you know, certain laws that, you know, that we can see the same thing at the same time in terms of not wanting to lower the vote, but being very happy to incarcerate children. Is actually, it does make perfect sense viewed through an adultist lens, where the primary impetus is to control what children and young people do. And so part of, I guess, our thinking is not just to surface the challenges to that and to try and prompt new ways of thinking, but to work with children and young people to communicate the findings of our research in ways that help them understand what's going on around them and how they might respond. So I popped into the chat there. I mean, I don't need to play it now, but we're working with a group of students at Western Sydney University who are creating videos, one of which is on the criminalisation of protest and Rob's work. And the student reaction to that has been immense. So one of the things we're interested in is how young people who are concerned about the climate crisis but don't see themselves as advocates or activists can be connected into this work. And so this student who did this video was kind of like saying, I had no idea about this as a setting, and the students that have observed it and the commentary, you know, on the platforms we've shared it on, has been really, really interesting. So, yeah, I guess it's sort of just a broader comment about the fact that part of this work for me is about surfacing and making visible, you know, to Judith's point about the invisibilization of children and young people, but also the structures and the systems and the cultures around them that allow these kinds of injustices to perpetuate. Anyway.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have a question from Barney, and it's a two-parter. So since 2019, we've seen a new cohort of young people reach an age where they may wish to participate in climate action. Are we seeing this new cohort transition into activism and into leadership roles? And part two, is there some kind of leadership structure to young people's climate action across the country, or is it more spontaneous and localized? And in any event, is there a process of self-reflection to determine if strategies or methodologies can be improved to more effectively achieve outcomes? So there's a lot in that one, but if anyone wants to pick up on any kind of part of that.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, Basha, do you want to talk to the first part of that about where young people in the movement, particularly in the early phases, 2018 and 2019, have kind of moved into other roles? And I know you've done, it's not a part of our project, but you've done some other work thinking about that question of like leadership and training and succession and movement renewal.
Yeah, it was actually interesting to see who kind of stayed in the movement and who didn't. And today I'm at a Woodside, like a Stop Woodside festival thing in Monash Uni actually, and it was really interesting to bump into some people who had been doing school strike for climate when I was. And I think what we found, I did a little bit of South Asian organizing a couple years ago, and we found that there were, I would say, like quite a few people of color who stepped out of the space purely because they were dealing with racism, or they were dealing with feeling unsafe going to protests and those kinds of things. And like one of my friends was talking about, you know, their parents being worried that they'd be deported if they like kept doing the organizing work because they weren't a citizen, so or didn't have PR either. So I think that is an element and like a worry for at least people of color to continue staying in the space. And there's also, you know, immigrant parents, there's all those like model minorities standards as well that make it quite difficult at times. I know that I had my own struggles kind of going against that. But I think on the other hand, it's also we were trying to look at training methods and how we could actually keep young people and how we could mentor them. And I did do a bit of mentoring with School Strike after I graduated high school. And what we found is that time and like financial compensation not being available in a lot of cases made it really, really difficult for young people to sustain in the space. Because I mean, I'm lucky enough to work in a sustainable space now, but that's not the case for everyone straight out of high school or anything like that. So I think creating those opportunities, and again, a lot of like companies and folks are like, we want young people to be part of it. And I'd probably say the new possibilities and a couple of other research spaces are one of the only that are actually keen to lead with it and take action on it, which has been great in my case, but also for a lot of other people who may not have had those connections or that exposure. It's meant that they've kind of had to step away because yeah, we are dealing with a bunch of different crises. And I think it is difficult when you have those different barriers of maybe being First Nations or a person of color, and then also the financial issues around staying in a movement that does not always pay very well.
Fantastic, thank you so much. That's a really great response. And so picking up on some of what we've been talking about so far around, I think, you know, this is a nice continuation from Milo's question around, you know, lowered kind of voting age, maybe having a relationship with criminal responsibility or criminalisation. So from Sarah Pickard, we have, how do you think young people's attitudes to elected politicians and democracy and to police or policing have been affected and maybe will be affected as they age?
Well, I can kick off from that. So, Sarah, we did, as I said, we did a round of in-depth interviews with people who had taken part in mainly in the protests. And we're going to be redoing some of those interviews this year. So trying to get an understanding about how people's attitudes might have changed over time. But from the 2023 data, I think there are a couple of really clear themes in terms of people's attitudes towards elected politicians and democracy more generally. One was a strong sense of hope in, at least in this, so we were focusing on the Australian context in particular, but a strong sense of hope that the more diversity that we were seeing in the Australian Parliament, particularly with Teals and independents, was a good thing. So there's a real kind of shift away from the major parties, which might seem to fly in the face of the results of the last election. But I think a lot of people would agree that the strong vote for Labor in the Australian context, including among young people, was actually a vote against the coalition and against the kind of Trumpian politics that was maybe kind of being pushed through in some of their campaigning, or coming through in some of their campaigning. So I think that they're like, our interview data definitely reflects that sort of some of the broader political attitudes research that shows that people like generally are seeing a decline in the trust of politicians, particularly the major political parties, and are looking for a different kind of representative. I think we don't actually, we didn't capture any data around police and policing, but certainly that's something that we'll be doing in the next round, because we want to understand why people may or may not be continuing to take part in some of the actions, including, say, blockades, for instance, that are now being led by organisations like Rising Tide. So, I mean, like, I might throw to you, Rob, because you'll probably have something to say about this, but I think one of the really interesting things is that certainly amongst some climate activists, including young climate activists, there is a real willingness to be arrested. In fact, it's like, well, obviously it's a tactical response to the politics of climate and to the politics of protest. And definitely in the Newcastle Rising Tide protests, we saw quite coordinated efforts in that regard, including very, very old people as well as very young people, like deliberately putting themselves out there. So, and I'll just do a little plug for our next Silent Majority podcast episode, because Varsha interviewed Violet Coco, who Rob referred to, and who's a prominent activist in the Australian context. He talks a little bit about what that, like what strategic, I don't know what you even, if there's a name for it, Rob, is there like deliberate arrest or some, whatever it is, she kind of talks about it from her perspective as a young person. So yeah, I think there's something very interesting there, but obviously it also, what we've also seen in some of our interviews and observational work is that, at least in the Australian context, there are a lot of young people, particularly who are here on temporary visas. So they've either got temporary residency with their families, or they're here as students or, backpackers. And despite the fact that they have just as much right to protest and to express their concerns about climate change wherever they are on the planet, they're aware that, at least in a country like Australia, we have laws that make it possible. And in fact, there are precedents of where students have been deported for their participation in direct action. And that's certainly something that is, I think, impacting kind of the profile, if you like, of the movement, at least in the Australian case. So yeah, those are some thoughts.
I can add in on top of that, Pip. There's a wonderful big essay by Perry Anderson in a recent issue of the London Review of Books, where he's addressing the question of, are we seeing a regime change in the sense of a shift away from the neoliberal paradigm of the last three, 4 decades? His argument is no, we're not, and I think he's right. And his big point, of course, is that one of the political effects of neoliberalism has been a hollowing out of politics. Politics as properly antagonistic, properly contentious, and properly committed to exploring different points of view. Historically, social movements could, 50, 60 years ago, assume that one of the major political parties would be on their side, one way or the other, whatever it was, whatever the issue was. Now that can no longer be guaranteed. And it does seem to me that when you have a sort of Tweedledum, Tweedledee effect, where the choices between two parties are exactly the same as each other, you are going to see the kind of effects that we're seeing in many Western liberal democracies now, as the major parties are losing support. There's a turning towards independent voices, but we know that's not always that effective because they don't have the power to pass in or introduce new policy or pass new legislation. So I think we're in a very transitional period right now. And I think the question of how young activists are now thinking about the next stage, do they join one of the parties? Do they continue to engage in social movement protest? Do they engage in what often seems more effective but a bit of a niche activity, that is strategic litigation? Or what? And that, I think, is the question. How can we be, the question of political efficacy never goes away, and how you judge it and what you judge will be more efficacious. Seems to me a very context-specific kind of practice of evaluating what's on offer in your particular political culture. So I think it's a big question. And my sense is that certainly I did a little study of 4 trajectories of climate activists, one of whom has stayed true to the climate litigation. She happens to be a First Nations person because she's had success going back over a decade, taking on big mining companies. The others have taken quite different trajectories in terms of moving from protest to litigation, or moving from litigation to protest. So it's a moot point, I think, about how people judge the political effectiveness of the options that are available to them. And that's always a constrained choice anyway. We don't have perfect choice about the kinds of politics we'd like to engage in.
Fantastic, thank you. And I just have one final question, which I think actually builds off what you were just saying, Rob, quite well. This is from Vanessa, who had to duck out, but I think it's still quite pertinent. The environmental movement often has a bit of a lull when we have a Labor government, as people get further engaged in policy processes and technical details. Do you see anything on this occurring yet with young people? I think this maybe goes to the point you were just making, Rob, about no longer being able to feel comfortably that a party is going to back you on one issue or another. Do you think that that's the case now, or maybe there's still an element of thinking the Labor Party is a bit more sympathetic?
Well, maybe can I start? Say something. I just remember that the last election in Australia, there was a lot of critique from young people, some prominent young people, about their disillusionment with the two-party system. And that's not unique to young people, but I think that was expressed quite a bit during the campaign, or and after the campaign. Yeah, go on.
No, I don't have anything to add.
I was going to say something else, but I forgot. I think that also a lot of young people are deeply pissed off. In particular, I think it was 2 weeks after the election, the Albanese government gave there was approval by the government to open up the Northwest Shelf in Western Australia that's going to sort of spew out something like, I don't know, how many billions of tonnes of emissions for the next however many years. And, it's not as if they wouldn't have known that. And I think that there are a lot of young people who are quite disillusioned, but I don't know how you quantify that, but that's just my sense of what I've been looking at and reading.
I'd like to add just one little point, because it's a plug for the another independent in the federal government, federal parliament, Sophie Scamps, who's putting up a really interesting piece of legislation, which is actually based off a Welsh piece of legislation which has been in place since 2015. The Welsh government committed back then to require all public bodies in Wales to take account of what they called a sustainability principle, but which Scamps has turned into the idea of a positive duty to secure the benefits both of current people and future generations, and across a range of social, cultural, economic and sustainability dimensions, if you like. And I just would add that right now, this month, the European Union Commission is releasing an equivalent manifesto, and they've appointed a commissioner for future well-being, a guy called McAuliffe, to look over the development for Europe of an equivalent framework of, I suppose you call it a principled commitment. It's a bit like human rights legislation, where you ask, is this new policy compliant with, consistent with human rights? And in this occasion, we're seeing an equivalent attempt here to make the principle of positive duty to prevent harm and promote flourishing lives will become a test that will be applied across the board to existing and potentially new legislation or new policies across all the dimensions that governments currently intervene in. And I think that's a very positive shift, and seems to be optimistic and forward-looking.
Can I just add one bit about that scamp thing, because it has got some good stuff in it, but I'm just looking for the page where it says, yes, we've got to have the Crown, there's got to be a positive duty, but she says very clearly that the Crown or the government cannot be held legally liable if it does not exercise that duty of care. So no one can, it's got no legs, basically.
No remedies.
It's got no remedies. So it's got no authority, because the government can continue not exercising a duty of care, but then there's no accountability, because there's no ability. It's been written out of the legislation, as I read it, that anybody can sue the government or hold them legally liable. And I think that, even though it's a really good piece of legislation, that is like really disappointing. Why has that been added? I don't know. Just trying to find the page.
Page 2.
How do you know? Yeah, it's
no, that's the memorandum. Anyway.
Yeah, here it's set. Where's it? This act does not make the Crown liable to any pecuniary penalty or to be prosecuted for an offence. All right. So it basically means that you can have this bill or law in place, but it's got no legs. No, you can't do it. So that nobody can sue the government for failing to exercise a duty of care if somebody's harmed. So I've not heard much talk about that.
Right. Look, fantastic. So I think with that, we are both through the questions, so we can probably start to wrap up. So could everyone please join me in thanking Pip, Luigi, Rob, Judith and Varsha for a fantastic presentation and discussion today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. And just before we hop off the call, I'd like to take the opportunity to plug the next event in our seminar series. So on Wednesday, September 24th at 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. time slot again, we have a session on the political dynamics of the weird world of wellness, which I think is going to be a really cool session. So please do come along if you can. And I'll also plug that some of the work that you've heard about today is going to be in a upcoming special issue edited by Pip, Judith and Michelle Catanzano of Journal of Applied Youth Studies. So keep an eye out for that one as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Julia. Thanks, Steve. Thanks
so
for having us, and to everyone who's joined.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Everyone take care.